In 1714, a seemingly innocuous census document from the Kingdom of Prussia surfaced, listing something strange and unsettling. Beneath the names of villagers, farmers, and craftsmen who populated the small, tightly knit towns in the region, there were a few names marked with a chilling phrase, "disappeared by order." It was a simple notation, written in the same bureaucratic hand that had recorded the population's details, ages, occupations, and family ties, but the words carried with them a weight of mystery, a shadow that has lingered ever since. What exactly did disappeared by order mean? Who were these people? And why were they erased so methodically from the fabric of history? For the modern eye, this discovery feels like the beginning of a dark and twisted tale, one where the past comes alive with secrets long buried by time, secrecy, and power. But for those living in 1714 Prussia, it was likely something far more ominous, the action of a state that held complete control over the lives and destinies of its citizens. In a world where the line between the sovereign and the subject was not just blurred but razor-thin, what would prompt someone to disappear, by order, no less? Prussia, at this time, was a kingdom under the iron grip of an absolute monarch, Frederick William I. The Prussian state was known for its military discipline, its highly organized bureaucracy, and its deep surveillance of its population. Life in the kingdom was regulated down to the smallest detail. The king himself had a reputation for micromanaging even the most mundane aspects of daily life. The Prussian army, one of the most formidable military forces in Europe, was not just a tool for war but a method of control that shaped the very structure of society. The kingdom was one of the earliest examples of what we would now call a police state, and the census, a seemingly straightforward civic tool, was yet another method by which the monarch could keep track of his people. It wasn't just a population count, it was a ledger of control. What's unsettling, however, is that in this sea of names, some were struck out, erased with cold finality, as though they had never existed. Or worse, as if they never had the right to. These disappearances, far from being anomalies or clerical errors, speak to something much darker. For when a person is marked as having disappeared by order, it suggests that they were not the victims of some random tragedy or act of violence. No, these were people whom the state itself had decided were to be erased from public memory. The reasons for their disappearance could range from political dissent to personal vengeance, or perhaps even something more nefarious, something known only to those with the power to command such acts. But what could possibly justify this level of control over the lives of ordinary citizens? To understand the significance of these disappearances, it's essential to grasp the nature of Prussian society in the early 18th century. The monarchy of Frederick William I was marked by an almost obsessive need to maintain order, discipline, and loyalty. Citizens were not merely subjects, they were assets, soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, all serving the machine of the state. At the same time, the king had little patience for disorder or rebellion. The Prussian military was feared, not just for its strength on the battlefield, but for its ability to stamp out any perceived threat to the monarchy, whether that threat came from within the kingdom's borders or from outside. The idea of disappearing people without a trace may seem like something that belongs in the world of shadowy modern regimes, but in Prussia, it was just another method of ensuring stability. People who became inconvenient, whether through crime, disobedience, or even suspicion, could simply vanish. They might be executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Or, if the powers that be saw fit, they could simply be written out of existence, their names removed from official records, their very existence expunged from history. It was a terrifying reminder of the totalitarian power of the state, a state that could decide who lived and who was forgotten. The unsettling nature of these disappearances raises several questions. How did these people disappear? Were they executed publicly, in some gruesome display of state power? Or were they taken in the dead of night, their families never knowing their fate? Was there a formal process for erasing someone, a cold, bureaucratic procedure that followed a chilling protocol of elimination? And, perhaps most disturbingly, how did the people living in these small Prussian towns respond to such disappearances? Were they aware of the danger of being disappeared? Or was this a world where life and death were so tightly controlled that people didn't even question when others vanished? The notations on the census records are sparse. No names, no specifics, just a cold, indifferent phrase, disappeared by order. But the very existence of such a record suggests that the authorities who created it were well aware of the gravity of their actions. To erase someone from public record, to wipe their existence from the collective memory, was not just a matter of practical necessity. It was an act of power, one that forced every person in the kingdom to realize that the state could control not only their actions but also their very place in history. The harsh reality of life under Frederick William I's rule is difficult for modern eyes to fully comprehend. The power of the monarchy was absolute, and the people had little recourse when they found themselves on the wrong side of the king's will. The idea of being disappeared by the state was not something one could easily resist. For those living in the shadows of this powerful state, there was always the fear that one day they might find their names listed in such a manner, and that their families would have to live with the stigma of their disappearance. In some ways, this dark chapter of Prussian history feels eerily familiar. It's easy to draw parallels between the disappeared of 1714 Prussia and the victims of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, where political dissidents, minorities, or those simply inconvenient to the state were erased from existence in a similarly cold and calculated manner. The mechanism of state control, once set in motion, could continue unchecked, erasing not only the lives of individuals but the very memory of their existence. This, perhaps, is one of the most disturbing elements of the disappeared in the Prussian census. It wasn't just a death sentence, it was a total erasure, a silencing of lives that never got the chance to be remembered. As we examine this enigmatic record, we are confronted with more questions than answers. Who were these people? What did they do to deserve such a fate? And why, more than 300 years later, does their story still haunt us? The disappeared by order might be little more than a footnote in a dusty old record, but their absence speaks volumes about the power of the state, the fragility of life under such regimes, and the eerie silence of history's forgotten victims. The fact that such an event could occur in 1714 Prussia, and that it continues to intrigue us today, suggests that there is something deeply unsettling about the way history can be shaped, controlled, and, in some cases, erased. It is a mystery that still lingers, one that calls out from the past, asking us to consider the price of order, the cost of control, and the lengths to which a state will go to ensure that no one, no matter how small or insignificant, can ever truly disappear. In the early 18th century, Prussia was a kingdom teetering on the edge of transformation. It was a period marked by significant political upheaval, a time when the very nature of governance was changing across Europe. Frederick William I had ascended to the throne in 1713, a monarch who would go on to define the future of Prussia with an iron fist and a mind sharpened by military discipline. The monarch's reign was characterized by a singular focus on the militarization of society, on building a formidable army and a highly organized bureaucracy that could maintain control over every aspect of life. For the people of Prussia, life under Frederick William I was one of strict regulation, intense scrutiny, and absolute loyalty to the crown. At the heart of Prussia's governmental structure was its highly structured and efficient bureaucracy, a mechanism of control that reached deep into the lives of its citizens. The state was organized like a machine, with every individual assigned a role, a title, and a purpose within its rigid framework. Citizens were expected to serve the state, whether through military service, agricultural labor, or trade, and those who failed to do so, whether through defiance, insubordination, or even personal failure, could easily find themselves erased from public records. The absolute nature of the Prussian monarchy meant that there were no middle grounds. Loyalty to the crown was absolute, and disobedience was met with swift and often violent punishment. The role of the military was central to this system. Prussia, at the time, was a kingdom that relied heavily on its army, one of the most powerful military forces in Europe. Frederick William I understood the importance of having a disciplined and loyal military, not just for national defense, but as a means of social control. The army was not only the king's tool of conquest, but also his instrument for maintaining order within the kingdom's borders. The military's reach extended far beyond the battlefield. It was a social force that infiltrated every aspect of life in Prussia. It's not just that the king sought to militarize his nation, it was that the military came to represent the very foundation of the state itself. This militarization of society was coupled with a new approach to governance. The king instituted reforms aimed at tightening his grip on the populace. The state increasingly relied on censuses, detailed records of the population's composition, including their names, ages, occupations, and even their military readiness. These censuses were not merely tools of demographic record-keeping. They were instruments of power. Through them, the state could track the location, occupation, and status of every subject within its borders. The census served as an unblinking eye, watching over the people, ensuring that everyone had a place within the kingdom's highly controlled order. It was a mechanism that helped the state build its empire, recruit its army, and maintain its iron grip on its citizens. Yet, As much as the census was about control, it also spoke to the fragility of the individual in this system. In a society where everything was meticulously accounted for, where even the smallest detail of a person's life was recorded and catalogued, what happened when someone fell out of favor with the state? What happened when a person was no longer useful, when they no longer served the needs of the crown? These questions are at the core of the mystery surrounding the disappeared by order entries in the 1714 Prussian census. The historical context of Prussia in the early 18th century offers a glimpse into a society where the idea of individual rights was almost non-existent. The state's power was absolute, and the monarch's will was law. In such a system, the notion of disappearance wasn't just a metaphorical one, it was a literal possibility. A person could be erased from history, not just by death, but by the whim of those in power. This is what makes the disappeared by order notation so chilling. It suggests that these individuals were not simply lost to time or forgotten. They were deliberately removed, erased from the state's official records as if they had never existed. It is a reminder of just how fragile life could be in a world governed by absolute power. The census, in its cold, bureaucratic efficiency, serves as a symbol of this power. It is both a tool for organization and a weapon of control. The fact that an individual could be marked as disappeared by order suggests that the census was not just a passive record. It was an active instrument of governance, one that could shape a person's fate based on little more than the will of those in power. There was no trial, no public outcry, no formal process by which someone could contest their disappearance. One moment, a person existed in the records. The next, they were erased, their name struck through and replaced by the impersonal, bureaucratic phrase that signified their removal. But what does this say about the society in which these disappearances occurred? What does it mean for the people who lived under such a regime? In a place like 1714 Prussia, where the line between the ruler and the ruled was so sharply defined, the act of erasure was both a tool of control and a method of instilling fear. When people saw that their neighbors, their family members, or even their fellow villagers had disappeared from the records, they had no recourse to question why. They could only wonder in silence, their thoughts filled with fear and suspicion. It was a world where conformity was valued above all else, where those who did not fall in line, whether through disobedience, crime, or other perceived transgressions, could simply vanish without a trace. It was not just the loss of a person, it was the loss of any trace of their existence, their very presence in the world. In this context, the disappeared by order entries are not just a historical curiosity, they are a chilling testament to the power of the state over the lives of its citizens. They remind us of the depths to which a government can go to maintain control, to ensure that its will is obeyed without question. In Prussia, the census was more than a record. It was a weapon in the hands of the state, one that could be wielded to silence dissent and erase any trace of those deemed inconvenient or undesirable. The people who were marked as disappeared by order were not simply victims of a random act of violence or misfortune. They were casualties of a system in which the individual had little say in their fate. In a world where the king's word was final, where the state could decide who lived and who was erased from memory, the line between life and death was often drawn by the cold, bureaucratic hand of the government. It is a reminder of the fragility of life in such a system, where the very act of disappearing could be a tool of power, a means by which the state maintained its dominance over its subjects. The disappearance of these individuals, and the way in which their names were struck from the records, forces us to confront a difficult truth, that history, as we know it, is often shaped by those in power, and that the stories of those who fall outside the lines of authority can be lost forever. The disappeared by order are not just figures in a dusty old census. They are a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked state power, and of the terrifying possibility that, in such a system, no one is ever truly safe from erasure. The Prussian census of 1714 was a remarkable document, but it was far more than just a record of names and numbers. It served as a meticulous account of the kingdom's population, a bureaucratic tool designed to keep track of every man, woman, and child within the kingdom's borders. In a society as controlled and organized as Prussia, a census wasn't just a reflection of who lived where. It was a manifestation of the state's ability to govern, monitor, and control. Every detail mattered, from the names of individuals to their occupations, their places of residence, their wealth, and even their potential for military service. But within this framework of precision and structure, there existed anomalies, details that couldn't be explained within the conventional understanding of how the census functioned. Among these was the chilling notation, disappeared by order. At first glance, the census was a typical bureaucratic instrument. It recorded the names of those living in each town, their ages, occupations, and familial relationships. For a kingdom like Prussia, which was driven by military efficiency and a highly organized state apparatus, such data were invaluable. These records helped the government assess everything from tax revenues to military recruitment needs. In essence, the census was the cornerstone of a well-functioning, highly disciplined society. The Prussian monarch, Frederick William I, understood the importance of these records. They weren't just tools for taxation or logistics, they were tools of power. Every person in the kingdom had a place, a designation, and a purpose, and this was reflected in the official records that tracked their existence. But while most entries were predictable, name, age, occupation, and sometimes a military rank, there were those few cases that stood out. The disappeared by order entries, scattered throughout the census, tell a different story. These people weren't just missing, they had been removed, erased from public memory by the explicit order of the state. Unlike the usual deaths or exiles that could be explained by the passage of time, these disappearances were marked with cold finality, suggesting something far more deliberate and sinister. This notation raises immediate questions. Who were these individuals, and why were they singled out? What was it about them that warranted such an extreme action? Were they criminals, political dissidents, or simply people who fell out of favor with the monarchy? In a society where the state had absolute power, where the monarch's will was law, the idea that someone could disappear in such a way isn't as surprising as it might seem. The Prussian state, with its highly militarized structure and its unyielding grip on power, had the means to make people vanish without a trace. To understand why these individuals were marked in this way, it's crucial to explore the nature of the state itself. Prussia, under Frederick William I, was not just a kingdom, it was a model of absolutism. The king's authority extended over every aspect of life, from the military to the economy, to even the most intimate details of the population's lives. People in Prussia were not merely subjects, they were components in a vast machine, each one serving a particular function. If a person fell out of line, or if their function was no longer deemed necessary, they could be removed from the system. In such a world, disappearances weren't just possible, they were a means of maintaining order. The Prussian monarch didn't just rule through laws or edicts, he ruled through control of the very structure of society. The state was a finely tuned apparatus, and anyone who caused disruption or presented a problem was easily disposed of. This wasn't just about executions or imprisonment. Those actions were visible, public. The real power of the state lay in its ability to erase individuals quietly, to make them vanish from history altogether. To be struck from the census was a death sentence in itself, a removal from the records, from memory, from society. The census, in a way, became the ultimate tool of surveillance. It wasn't enough to know who was alive. The state needed to know exactly what each person was doing, where they were, and what role they played in the larger societal structure. Military service was a particular concern, as Prussia relied heavily on its army to maintain its power both domestically and abroad. Every able-bodied man had a place in the military machine, whether he served actively or was kept on standby. Those who didn't comply, whether they resisted service or refused to submit to the state's will, could find themselves marked for disappearance. But what about those who didn't fall into this category? What about those who didn't fit neatly into the role the state assigned them, whose lives didn't align with the kingdom's rigid structure? These were the people who became expendable in the eyes of the Prussian authorities. Perhaps they were social outcasts, or individuals who had fallen afoul of the monarchy for reasons unknown. Their removal from the census was an act of silencing, a way for the state to ensure that those who were inconvenient, those who didn't conform, were completely erased. The very fact that disappeared by order was a phrase that existed in official records speaks volumes about the nature of power in early 18th century Prussia. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a statement. It wasn't enough to simply remove someone from the town or from society. The state had to erase all traces of their existence. Their names were removed from a census, their homes abandoned, their families left to wonder what had happened. For those left behind, the erasure of a person's existence was a chilling reminder of the power the state had over them. It was a reminder that no one was truly safe, that the state could, at any time, decide to make someone disappear, to remove them from the very records of life itself. The disappeared by order entries in the census are, in a sense, a mirror of the state's power. They reflect a society in which individuals were not just controlled by law, but by the very fabric of bureaucracy itself. The state was not just an abstract entity, it was something tangible, something that could reach into the lives of ordinary people and dictate their fate. And that fate, as the census shows, could be eradicated in an instant. This is where the chilling nature of these disappearances comes into focus. In a world where the census was used not only to record but to regulate every aspect of life, the erasure of a person's name was an act that transcended mere physical removal. It was a mental and emotional erasure. The people who disappeared weren't just gone, they were unmade. They were erased from the record of human existence, their lives expunged from history itself. The Prussian state had perfected a method of erasure that left nothing behind but silence. In the context of the 1714 census, the act of disappearing someone was more than just a bureaucratic maneuver. It was a chilling reflection of the absolute power the state held over the lives of its subjects. When the monarchy could erase a person from the official record, it wasn't just about removing them from society. It was about asserting the king's absolute right to control not only the living but also the memory of the living. The disappeared by order were the forgotten ones, lost not to death but to the whims of a state that could decide who was worthy of being remembered and who wasn't. As we look at this remarkable document today, it serves as a haunting reminder of how easily history can be rewritten, how individuals can be silenced, and how power can operate in the shadows, unseen but deeply felt. The people marked disappeared by order may no longer exist in the records, but their absence leaves an indelible mark on the story of Prussia, a story that is still being pieced together, one erased name at a time. The chilling entries in the 1714 Prussian census, where individuals are listed simply as disappeared by order, raise unsettling questions that extend far beyond mere bureaucratic anomalies. These mysterious notations suggest that these people were not the victims of natural causes, accidents, or ordinary criminal activities. Rather, their disappearances were the result of some form of state-sanctioned action, an execution, exile, imprisonment, or perhaps an even more insidious form of disappearance. To fully understand who these individuals were and why they vanished, we must first delve into the social, political, and military dynamics of Prussia during this time. Prussia in the early 18th century was a kingdom defined by its rigid class structure, where every citizen had a designated role to play. The monarch, Frederick William I, was an absolute ruler, and the state was built on a military framework. The king's focus on military efficiency and control meant that the very structure of society was deeply intertwined with the needs of the army. People were classified not just by their birth or occupation but by their potential utility to the state. Military service, whether as a soldier, laborer, or support personnel, was a key expectation, and those who refused, resisted, or failed to fulfill this obligation were often seen as liabilities to the kingdom's order and strength. The strictness of the Prussian military regime was not merely a result of a desire for conquest. It was a necessity for survival in a volatile European landscape. As a result, the state sought to control nearly every aspect of the population's life. The census, as a tool of governance, played a crucial role in this system of control. It was more than a population count, it was an instrument of surveillance. It allowed the state to track every individual, their occupation, their family, and their physical capabilities. In such a system, there was little room for those who did not fit the mold, for those who were seen as unnecessary, problematic, or even rebellious. Those who were listed as disappeared by order were likely victims of this unyielding system. One possible explanation for their disappearance is that they had somehow fallen afoul of the state's military obligations. Military service in Prussia was not just a civic duty, it was a requirement for survival. The monarchy was obsessed with creating a standing army that could project power across Europe. Every able-bodied man was expected to serve in the military, and those who didn't comply faced severe consequences. Desertion, refusal to serve, or even evasion of military duties were grave offences. In a society that was as militarized as Prussia, individuals who shirked these duties could be dealt with harshly. They might be executed, imprisoned, or sent into forced labor, but they could also simply be disappeared from the official records, effectively erased from public memory. Another possibility is that the disappeared by order were victims of political repression. The early 18th century was a time of significant political and social tension in Prussia. The monarchy's control over its subjects was absolute, and any form of dissent or rebellion was met with swift and often brutal punishment. Political dissenters, whether they were radical thinkers, dissatisfied nobles, or ordinary citizens who spoke out against the state, could easily find themselves removed from society. In an age before the development of modern legal systems and human rights protections, accusations of disloyalty or subversion were enough to justify the disappearance of an individual. Those who opposed the monarchy or who were suspected of plotting against the crown could be arrested and disappeared without trial. their fates sealed by the arbitrary will of the monarch. Religious and social dissent may have also played a role in these disappearances. The early 1700s were a time of religious conflict in Europe, with many nations, including Prussia, struggling with the tension between Catholicism and Protestantism. In Prussia, the dominant religious group was Protestant, but there were significant Catholic minorities, especially in areas like Silesia. Religious dissent or perceived heresy could lead to severe punishment, including the forced exile or execution of individuals who did not conform to the state-sponsored religious order. It is entirely possible that some of those marked as disappeared by order were victims of religious persecution, erased from history because they did not adhere to the official beliefs of the Prussian monarchy. Equally important is the possibility that the disappeared were individuals who had been caught in the gears of a brutal class system. Prussia, like much of Europe at the time, was a deeply hierarchical society. The nobility, clergy, and military were at the top of the social ladder, while peasants, labourers, and the urban poor were relegated to the bottom. For those living at the margins of society, life was precarious. Economic hardship, social unrest, or even simple misfortune could lead to a person's fall from grace. The Prussian state, which relied on a strict social order to maintain stability, had no tolerance for social upheaval or disorder. Those who were seen as disruptive or unworthy of their station might be removed from society altogether, not just in terms of punishment but in the ultimate erasure from public memory. In the context of this rigid system, the act of disappearing someone was a powerful tool of control. It wasn't just about removing a person from a physical location, it was about erasing them from existence, ensuring that they would be forgotten. Erasure was a method of both punishment and deterrence. By removing someone from the records, the state sent a clear message to everyone else. This is what happens to those who step out of line. It was a form of terror, a reminder that no one was truly safe from the king's will. The mystery of the disappeared by order in the census reflects a darker side of history, one where individuals were powerless to resist the vast machinery of the state. While we can only speculate on the exact reasons for their disappearances, what is clear is that these individuals were victims of a society that prioritized control over individual rights. Their fates were sealed not by any form of justice or legal process, but by the arbitrary power of the state. Moreover, the fact that these names were never truly lost speaks to the persistence of the state's control. The Prussian census was not just a record of life, it was a record of power. By documenting the names of the disappeared in this manner, the state ensured that even in their erasure, these individuals were part of the kingdom's narrative. They became ghosts in the record, reminders of what could happen to those who failed to conform. Even though their names were struck from the official records, the census stands as a testament to the state's power to control, to monitor, and to silence. Ultimately, the individuals who vanished from the census were not merely forgotten, they were actively erased, their lives and identities obliterated by the will of the monarch. They were not casualties of war or disease but victims of a system that saw them as expendable, as unworthy of a place in the state's grand design. Their disappearances, though officially sanctioned and recorded in the annals of history, remain shrouded in mystery. Yet their erasure serves as a chilling reminder of the absolute power of the state, and of the fragility of the individual in a world where the very act of existing could be revoked at any moment. The idea of a state exercising absolute control over its citizens is not just a theoretical one, it has been a stark reality throughout history, particularly in authoritarian regimes. In 18th century Prussia, under the reign of Frederick William I, this notion of state power was taken to its extreme. The king's vision for Prussia was one of total control, both in terms of military might and bureaucratic efficiency. The Prussian state was not only a kingdom but a mechanism, a well-oiled machine where every citizen was a cog, and anyone who deviated from the state's expectations could be discarded without hesitation. The ability of the state to eliminate people, by erasing them from records, marking them as disappeared by order, was one of the clearest examples of this power. But how did this form of control manifest in everyday life? What does it tell us about the state's deeper function? Prussia, at this time, was a kingdom where authority flowed from the top down, with the king as the singular, unchallenged force of governance. Frederick William I was a monarch obsessed with order, discipline, and military prowess. He ruled with an iron fist, not just in terms of military expansion but also through an internal system of regulation that reached into every corner of Prussian society. There were strict laws that governed not just the rich or the powerful but the everyday lives of commoners. The country was defined by a sense of hierarchy, in which everyone had a place, and any deviation from this social order was not just frowned upon but actively discouraged. The census was one of the most potent tools in the hands of the monarch and his officials to maintain control over the population. The Prussian military was the backbone of this system. It wasn't just an institution for war, it was the central framework through which society operated. The king's obsession with having a powerful standing army meant that military service wasn't just an obligation, it was an expectation for every able-bodied male. From the moment a person was born in Prussia, their fate was largely determined by their potential service to the state. As a result, the monarchy demanded an extraordinary level of surveillance over the population, and the census was used to gather data on the people, their capabilities, and their value to the kingdom. The cold efficiency of this system was perhaps most apparent in how it dealt with those who were deemed unworthy, troublesome, or a threat to the state's delicate balance. The Prussian census, while seemingly a neutral record of the population, was also a method of ensuring that the monarchy's absolute power was never questioned. It wasn't just about recording who lived where, or how many soldiers were needed. The census also tracked who was useful and who wasn't. Those who didn't meet the state standards, whether through failure to serve, refusal to conform, or some perceived inadequacy, could simply vanish from the records. What was chilling about this system was how effectively it erased people from existence. The disappeared by order entries in the census are a haunting reminder of how the state could remove someone from history without a trace. But it wasn't just about the removal of an individual from a physical space. In a society as tightly controlled as Prussia, where the state had a hand in every aspect of life, the act of erasure meant more than just physical removal. It was a complete obliteration of a person's place in society, their identity, and their legacy. To be struck from the census was not just to be exiled or imprisoned. It was to be erased from the collective memory of the nation. This erasure was a form of control in itself. The state had the power to make someone disappear, and in doing so, it asserted its dominance over not just the individual but the collective identity of society. In Prussia, where the military was the central force that governed every aspect of life, such disappearances were a stark reminder of how easily lives could be molded and shaped to fit the needs of the state. But the real power of the disappeared by order notation wasn't just in the individual disappearances, it was in the message it sent to the rest of the population. The state didn't just eliminate individuals. It demonstrated to everyone that there were no true individual rights, no protection from the absolute will of the monarch. The mere existence of such a record sent a message of fear and control. Conformity was mandatory, and the state had the power to silence those who didn't fit into its vision. If you weren't part of the system, you could simply vanish. It was an implicit warning to everyone living under the monarchy's watchful eye: challenge the state, and you too could be erased from existence. The state's power to control, to dictate the terms of life and death, was absolute in Prussia. Frederick William I's goal was not just to expand his territory, but to create a well-disciplined, obedient populace that served his kingdom's military needs. His efforts were reflected in the very fabric of Prussian society, where the military and bureaucracy were two sides of the same coin. The census, in this context, wasn't just a tool of enumeration, it was a tool of surveillance and control. It allowed the state to keep track of every person, every family, and every potential threat to the established order. Yet, this level of control came at a cost. While the state could ensure conformity and suppress dissent, it also created a climate of fear and paranoia. The very existence of the disappeared by order entries in the census tells us about the undercurrents of suspicion and distrust that pervaded Prussian society. To be erased from the records wasn't just a punishment, it was a warning, a reminder that no one was truly safe from the state's reach. Even the most ordinary citizens, who had no interest in politics or rebellion, were vulnerable. Their lives could be appended without warning, their names struck from the record without explanation. The census was a tool for the state to track, catalogue, and analyze the lives of its subjects. It wasn't just a record, it was a system of surveillance. Every person, every family, every member of society had a place in the kingdom's official ledger, their status, occupation, and even potential military duty meticulously documented. But this documentation wasn't merely passive. It was, in many ways, an active exercise in domination. If a person was seen as a threat or as undesirable for any reason, be it political, social, or personal, the state could mark them as disappeared by order, striking them from the record. What made this particularly frightening was that the state didn't even need to justify its actions. It was not required to explain who was marked for disappearance, nor did it need to give any reasoning to the families of those erased from the records. In an environment where loyalty to the king was paramount, dissent, disobedience, or any form of challenge to authority was considered not only unacceptable but punishable by complete erasure. The fear that one could be wiped from existence without so much as a trial or explanation created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion. Citizens lived knowing that even the smallest transgression could result in a disappearance. People had no way of knowing whether a neighbor, a friend, or even a family member might be the next to vanish. But the practice of disappearing individuals wasn't unique to Prussia. It was part of a wider pattern in European monarchies, especially during times of military conflict or political instability. The power of the monarch was often so overwhelming that it was seen as an intrinsic part of the state's survival. The right to erase a person's existence was one of the most chilling manifestations of this power. However, what set Prussia apart was the efficiency and organization with which this control was exercised. Frederick William I's regime was particularly focused on precision. He built an empire of efficiency that extended from the military down to the smallest details of society. The census, as a bureaucratic tool, was one of the many mechanisms that helped maintain this order. The implication of such a system was that no one could trust in their own place within society. People could be added to the census one year and erased the next, leaving no trace of their existence. The very fabric of community life was undermined by the constant threat of removal. What made these disappearances particularly dangerous was the fact that they were so pervasive. They were not the result of random acts of violence or isolated criminal activity. They were the result of state policy, designed to maintain control at all costs. The deep sense of fear and control was likely felt most acutely in Prussian towns and villages, where personal relationships were often interconnected, and the community relied on a delicate balance of social and economic roles. The town census could serve as a reminder of the ever-present power of the state, a power that could dissolve a person's life as easily as it could erase their name from the books. Families were left with no closure, no explanation, and no justice. They were left with an empty space where a loved one had once been, an absence that would never be addressed. The fact that we are still grappling with the mystery of these disappeared by order entries today speaks to the haunting legacy of such practices. In many ways, these individuals are not just lost to history, they are symbols of the erasure of the individual in the face of absolute authority. Their disappearance wasn't simply a matter of them being removed from one document or one community. It was the obliteration of their very personhood. The disappeared were not just erased from the record, they were made to disappear from the collective memory of the people. In a time before modern communications and documentation, the state's ability to erase someone from the census meant that they could be erased from all forms of social reality. Their lives were effectively negated. Yet, the questions surrounding these disappearances remain unanswered. Who were these people, and what exactly led to their fate? Did they step out of line politically, refuse military service, or simply find themselves on the wrong side of the state's policies? Why were some erased, while others, perhaps just as vulnerable or disobedient, were allowed to live on in the records? These are questions that may never be answered, but they speak to the greater uncertainty of life under an absolutist regime. In Prussia, there was no clear line between justice and arbitrary power. The state could decide who lived and who vanished, and its ability to do so with such cold finality left little room for the individual to assert their rights or even their existence. The disappeared by order entries in the Prussian census stand as a dark reminder of how absolute power can shape history, not only through violence or war but through the quiet, bureaucratic act of erasing individuals from the story of a nation. It is a sobering thought that, in a world governed by such control, the value of a life could be reduced to a mere entry in a ledger, and that life could be erased with a single stroke of a pen. The mystery surrounding the disappeared by order entries in the 1714 Prussian census is not just about the erasure of individual lives. It raises profound questions about the very nature of power, control, and the fragility of personal identity under an authoritarian regime. The question that looms large in the minds of historians and scholars is, how could such disappearances be institutionalized, and what did this practice say about the larger societal structures at play in Prussia during the early 18th century? To begin to understand this, we must first acknowledge the deep-seated fear and anxiety that permeated the lives of ordinary Prussians. Living in a kingdom governed by absolute monarchy meant that every citizen was always under scrutiny, constantly reminded that their existence was tied to the will of the king. Frederick William I, who ascended to the throne in 1713, believed that absolute control was necessary for the stability and survival of his state. His reign was marked by an obsession with order, discipline, and military efficiency. His personal vision for Prussia was one of a tightly controlled society, where everyone had a defined role and function, and deviation from that role was punishable. Frederick William I's military focus meant that the very structure of Prussian society was shaped around the needs of the army. The monarchy's power was centralized, and the monarch was the sole authority in all matters. This created a system where the individual was insignificant in comparison to the might of the state. This perspective was not unique to Prussia. It was a reflection of the broader European tendency toward absolutism, where monarchs sought to consolidate power and ensure that the state was never at risk of destabilization. But what made Prussia particularly chilling was the efficiency and ruthlessness with which these goals were pursued. Every aspect of life in Prussia was designed to reinforce the king's authority. One of the ways in which the state exerted its power was through meticulous record-keeping, and the 1714 census was a perfect example of how Prussia utilized bureaucracy to enforce its grip on the population. The census was not merely a tool for gathering data, it was an instrument of surveillance, control, and discipline. It was used to document every person's place in society, their role, and their potential utility to the state. Every citizen had their existence mapped out on paper, and this allowed the monarchy to monitor, adjust, and, if necessary, erase individuals who were no longer seen as useful or who were deemed a threat to the established order. In such a society, where the state had such pervasive control, to be marked as disappeared by order was more than just a bureaucratic action. It was a method of punishment and coercion. It was a tool for instilling fear and ensuring conformity. The individuals who were erased from the census did not simply vanish from a list. They were erased from the collective memory of the state. There was no funeral, no announcement, and often no explanation. One moment, a person's name appeared on the list, the next it was gone, as though they had never existed. This was a devastatingly powerful form of control. It made individuals realize that they were not just citizens, they were subjects to be manipulated at will. The very act of being erased was an extreme form of social death. People were not only stripped of their rights, they were rendered invisible, irrelevant, and forgotten. This was the ultimate consequence of disobedience in a society where the monarch's will was law, and it had profound psychological effects. The people of Prussia, particularly in the smaller towns and villages, would have understood that the census was not just a record of population. It was an active and dynamic list, capable of granting or taking away legitimacy. When someone disappeared from the list, it was a clear sign of their removal from the social order. In a community that relied so heavily on the monarchy's will to survive, this erasure was a terrifying reminder that no one was truly safe. The disappeared by order notations in the 1714 census are not isolated incidents. They are representative of a much larger system of control that permeated Prussian society. The monarchy was obsessed with maintaining absolute order, and any deviation from this order was seen as a threat to the stability of the state. This wasn't just about criminal activity or rebellion. It was about maintaining a strict hierarchical structure where every citizen had a role to play. Those who disrupted the order, even in the smallest way, could find themselves marked for removal. This systematic removal of individuals, coupled with the total erasure of their existence from the state's records, was an act of profound cruelty. It was not enough to simply punish or exile someone. The true power of the Prussian state lay in its ability to obliterate an individual's very identity. It could take away not just their physical freedom but their connection to the world around them. By striking someone's name from the census, the state stripped away their humanity, rendering them mere shadows in the historical record. What makes the disappeared by order even more chilling is the lack of explanation. The state did not owe anyone an explanation for why someone had been erased. In a society ruled by an absolute monarch, where the king's will was unquestionable, there was no need for transparency. If a person was removed from the record, it was not for any court to decide. They were simply removed, as though their very existence was a mistake that needed to be corrected. This absolute discretion was a powerful tool of control. People lived in fear, knowing that at any moment they could be struck from the record, just as easily as someone else had been before them. The unpredictability of who might disappear next only added to the terror of living under such a regime. It's important to understand that this erasure wasn't simply a matter of people being removed from a census. These individuals were effectively erased from society itself. The act of disappearance was not just about legal or bureaucratic invisibility. It was about severing all connections to community, family, and legacy. When a person was removed from the census, their family and friends would often be left with no explanation, no closure, and no recourse. These disappearances weren't a matter of justice. They were an exercise of raw, unchecked power. The power of the state to erase people from existence is a deeply unsettling reflection of how absolutism works in practice. It reveals the extent to which a monarch could shape not just the physical landscape of a country, but the very nature of existence itself. In a world where the state could make people vanish, the individual had no protection, no rights, and no guarantees. Their existence was tied to the whims of the monarch, and if those whims shifted, so too could their place in the world. The presence of disappeared by order in the census is a haunting reminder that history is often written by those in power. The erased individuals of Prussia may not have been recorded in the official histories, but their disappearance speaks volumes about the nature of state control. They were not mere victims of a harsh regime. They were symbols of the erasure of the individual in a world where absolute power reigned supreme. Their lives were defined by the state, and their deaths, or disappearances, were part of the state's control. To understand this is to understand the terrifying nature of absolute monarchy, where life and death were not personal but political, and where the very existence of the individual was contingent upon the whims of those in power. The disappeared by order entries in the 1714 Prussian census raise profound ethical and psychological questions about the nature of governance, the power dynamics between the state and the individual, and the extent to which a totalitarian regime can shape history. In the case of Prussia, these disappearances were not just the result of random acts of violence or political retribution. They were deliberate actions carried out by the state to maintain control, order, and absolute authority. To be erased from the census was to be erased from society itself, and the chilling reality of this power provides a glimpse into the inner workings of a regime that valued conformity above all else. The disappearances, however, also beg the question: how does a society come to accept such a brutal exercise of state power? How does a culture that values order, discipline, and loyalty reconcile with the terrifying consequences of that order, where the very act of existing can be wiped away at a moment's notice? In Prussia, the king's authority was supreme, and the state's ability to eliminate individuals without due process or explanation demonstrated the absolute and unchecked nature of that power. Frederick William I, the Prussian king at the time, ruled with a militaristic, autocratic vision that placed the needs of the state and the monarchy above those of the individual. In such a system, the concept of individual rights was secondary to the survival of the state itself. The disappeared by order entries are a stark reminder of what happens when the state becomes an all-powerful force capable of erasing anyone who does not conform to its demands. In a kingdom where the monarch wielded absolute power, the disappearance of an individual was not a rare exception. It was a reminder of the totalitarian grip the state had on its citizens. The census, as a bureaucratic tool, served not only to record the population but to control it. The state's ability to erase someone from the official records was a reflection of its broader control over every aspect of life. It wasn't just about knowing who lived where or how many soldiers were needed. It was about shaping the social fabric and determining who had the right to be part of the community. In this sense, the census was a tool of social engineering, a means by which the state could not only monitor the population but actively shape the roles and functions of its citizens. But the disappearance of individuals from the census also points to something deeper: the psychological and social effects of living under such an oppressive system. To live under the constant threat of erasure meant that every action, every word, and every choice had the potential to be monitored. It created an environment where suspicion thrived, and people were constantly aware that their lives were not their own. The threat of being disappeared by order was not merely an abstract fear. It was a very real possibility that could happen at any time, to anyone, and with no explanation. What made this reality even more terrifying was the complete lack of transparency or accountability. The king's decisions were final, and there was no process through which individuals could challenge or question their fate. The people of Prussia had no recourse. They could not appeal to a court or to a higher power for justice. If you were deemed undesirable by the state, if you were seen as a threat to the order or stability of the kingdom, you could simply be erased from existence. And when someone disappeared, there was no investigation, no public explanation, and often no mention of the event outside of the state's official records. The erasure of a person's name from the census was an act of complete control. It was not just about removing a name from a list, it was about removing a person from the very fabric of society, obliterating their identity and their legacy. The emotional toll on the people who witnessed these disappearances must have been profound. For a society where the state's power extended into every aspect of life, the removal of someone from the census was a reminder that no one was truly safe. The average person in Prussia understood that loyalty to the king was paramount, and any deviation from that loyalty could result in severe consequences. People were forced to live in a state of constant vigilance, aware that even the slightest misstep could lead to their erasure. This created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, where neighbors turned against each other, and even families could be torn apart by suspicion and paranoia. The fear of disappearance was not just a fear of physical removal, it was a fear of being forgotten, of being cast into an abyss where no one would remember you or your existence. The psychological effects of this kind of authoritarian control were profound and long-lasting. To live in a world where the state could erase you without explanation meant that every action was fraught with the possibility of consequence. The individual became less than a person. They became a cog in a machine, a number in a ledger, and their fate was determined not by their actions or their merit but by the whims of the state. In a society like Prussia, where the monarch's will was law, there was no room for dissent, for disagreement, or for nonconformity. The people understood that their place in the world was fragile, that at any moment they could be swept aside if they no longer served the needs of the kingdom. Furthermore, the impact of these disappearances was not just personal, it was societal.